Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. I'm Bob Allison. I chair the Rev 250 Advisory Group. We are a consortium of about 75 groups in Massachusetts planning commemorations of the beginnings of American independence. And our guest today is Emily Sneff. Emily is a historian of the Declaration of Independence, and her book, When the Declaration of Independence Was News, is coming out next April. Emily's also working on an exhibit opening this Saturday at the Museum of the American Revolution on the Declaration's journey. And so you are the person most focused on the Declaration. And it's a great topic and it's great. So what is important to you about the Declaration of Independence? What captivated you about this document?
Oh, that's a big question. So I started working on the Declaration over a decade ago through museum work and then transitioning into the civic education space, thinking about what resources people needed to best engage with the Declaration. And then when I went to grad school, I spent maybe a minute thinking about other topics and went back to the Declaration. So what I like to do is, by talking to the public, by engaging with different copies, by kind of surfacing stories that are maybe lesser known, is show just how much the founding document of the United States has to tell us, that it's not just about the parchment that was signed that's in the National Archives, but that there's all of these other pieces to the story. And so there's no shortage of things that interest me about the Declaration. And that's why I can call myself the Declaration lady and, keep this research going at least for the next year.
Because there are a lot of printings of it. And in fact, it's one of the surprising things that the printed version predates the parchment version.
Absolutely. Yeah. The process of declaring independence is really interesting to me. So there is this primacy of print that, on the night of July 4th, the first printed copies of the Declaration are being produced, just around the corner from Independence Hall. And it's not until a few weeks later that the delegates decide to create a parchment copy, written out in a fine hand to be signed. And so the signing is different from the declaring. And over time, that signed copy and the signers as a group of men who were never in the same room at the same time, became the predominant story. But actually the first printings, from John Dunlap all the way through the summer and fall, those are the copies that really interest me.
Yeah. So what happens to these copies? They're printed beginning on the night of July 4th. And then how do we know how many and then where they go?
Yeah, John Dunlap's broadsides, there's only 24 that survive now, and they are highly, highly valued, multi-million-dollar copies. And mostly the focus is just on the copies themselves, not on the stories behind them. So we kind of forget that they were printed in Philadelphia, but they were sent all over the place. And probably a few hundred copies were created to fulfill the needs of Congress to send the Declaration out to each of the states, to the Continental Army. And then they tried at least to send a copy to Silas Deane, their agent in France. That copy was thrown overboard to prevent interception. So there's all these Dunlap broadsides going out all over the place. And then other printers are copying from him or copying from other newspaper printings. Every active newspaper in the U.S. had the Declaration in its pages between July and August 76. So there's tons of printings, and that means there's a lot of people involved in that process.
Yeah. One of the things Jonathan discovered going through the records of town meetings in Massachusetts is every town meeting in their minute book, they write out the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, that was a specific thing for Massachusetts, that their order to disseminate the Declaration, they had Ezekiel Russell print broadsides, and then those were sent out to to ministers who were supposed to read the Declaration to their congregations. Some of those ministers refused to do so, which is an interesting chapter of my book. But a lot of them did. And then they were supposed to hand the Declaration off to the town clerk, who would record it in the town records, either by inserting the broadside physically in the town records or transcribing it. And I'm sure Jonathan can attest to this too. some of the clerk's transcriptions are just the messiest things you could ever find. The bad spelling, writing out the declaration too big and then having to, go on to the next line.
Right.
So it's a really interesting kind of look at, how focused were they on preserving this text the way that Congress intended it.
Yeah. And then one of the interesting things I find is they have in big letters United States of America as well as July 4th. So we have
Sure.
the country's name and birth date on the document. Was that planned by Congress or was that something Dunlap did?
That title kind of, after in Congress, July 4th, 1776, the title, A Declaration by the Representatives, that originated with the first rough draft from Thomas Jefferson and kind of stuck with the text. And then John Dunlap put in Congress, July 4th, 1776, at the top, the way that he would for any other resolution of the Continental Congress. So as it circulated, it reinforced the fact that that was the day, even though July 2nd was the day that Congress actually voted to declare independence. So by the following year, July 4th is Independence Day. That's the date that's associated with the Declaration permanently.
Rather than July 2nd, which is what John Adams had wanted.
Or at least that he thought that, there's a few moments in the summer of 76 that John Adams says are, the most decisive days in history. And he's very proud that we finally, got to this point. And July 2nd is certainly one of those. But I think that the text itself, the words of Congress explaining their decision, that ends up being sort of the key part of the story.
Right. And then on the parchment copy, United is in small letters and States of America is in the big letters. Yeah,
and I try to use as much as possible the plural United States rather than the singular, because that's much more a reflection of how the Continental Congress thought about the colonies turned states at that time. And we tend to forget that the Declaration was yoked with the Articles of Confederation and the Model Treaty. But those three documents were completed and ratified at different moments. So at the time that independence was declared, there was no formal confederation. And when you see how the Declaration was printed in Europe, how it was, copied in London newspapers and then translated in European papers, they are using the plural, either states or in many cases still referring to them as colonies to talk about the Declaration.
Interesting. We're talking with Emily Sneff, historian of the Declaration of Independence, and her book, When the Declaration Was News, will be coming out next year in the great year of 2026. And you conclude the book with Mary Catherine Goddard's printing in Baltimore in January of 1777. So why do we have a copy then? This is a copy actually the Congress commissions.
It is, yeah. For the book, I wanted to, it's almost like a microhistory. It's really zooming in on a particular moment in time before anyone knows what the legacy of the Declaration would be. And so I wanted to conclude with Goddard's printing because I see that as the transition from the time when the Declaration of Independence was news to the time when it becomes more like archival treasure. Because the Congress commissioned the Goddard broadsides to send a copy to each state to form the foundation of their state archives. And so that's a very different thing than trying to print broadsides or kind of publicize the news of independence. I love Goddard's printings because she made a lot of design choices within her broadside that are completely different than the design choices she made in July 76 when she prints the Declaration in her newspaper. And one of them, of course, is printing her full name on the broadside, whereas she printed her name, her newspaper under her initials, M.K. Goddard. So it's a really interesting printing. It's the first to include almost all of the signers. Thomas McKean hadn't signed the parchment by that point. And that comes back to haunt him later in his political career when people are relying on Goddard's printing and other early printings and saying, your name isn't on there. But of course, she was the first woman printer of the Declaration as of the July newspaper printing and certainly her January broadside printing.
Yeah. And there is a copy in the Massachusetts State Archives with John Hancock's signature because he sends it out as a true copy to all of the states.
Exactly. Yeah. Hancock and Thompson, Charles Thompson, the secretary, signed the Goddard broadsides as
Mhm.
true copies. And some of them remain in the state archives. One is in private hands. The one at the Rhode Island State Archives was recently conserved. It had broken into like 3 or 4 pieces. And
Mm.
but still at the bottom, for some reason, Mary Catherine Goddard's name, there's a big black line through it. And that's
Mm.
something that, the conservators can't
Interesting.
fix, and they don't know when in its history someone crossed out her name. But it's
Mm.
a fascinating, she got her printing career started in Rhode Island, and yet the
Right.
copy that's in the Rhode Island archives is trying to kind of erase her name from her
Wow.
product.
A Rhode Island printer who is jealous, or it's great. Not only does it have all of the signers except for Thomas McCain, it also has a woman's name at the bottom too. Which is,
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah. So you mentioned when the Declaration is news. I mean, that's the title of your book, and then it becomes an archival document. So, what's the reception like when this document is sent out to these various places?
It's a great question, because I think we assume 250 years on that the reception was mostly positive.
Hmm.
And it was in many cases. You have these public readings all across the United States that all have similar elements. People shouting huzzah, cannons firing, all these different kind of ritualistic things that take place. The destruction of the Royal Coat of Arms. This is
Right.
happening all over the place. But there's also people who are not happy with the Declaration,
Hmm.
who see it as a very clear turning point. And some of those people are involved in the process of declaring independence. Like I mentioned, the mostly
Hmm.
Anglican ministers in Massachusetts who did not want to proclaim the
Hmm.
Declaration to their congregation. One of my favorite stories is about a teenager on the island of Nantucket named Kezia Coffin. And someone brings a copy of the Declaration from Cape Cod over to Nantucket, and she reads it. And she says that she wishes the members of the Continental Congress had been hung 50 feet in the air before they would have been allowed to issue
Wow.
this declaration. And I love that story because this is a teenage girl who clearly has a very strong political
Hmm.
awareness and is
Hmm.
also in the minority in
Oh
Massachusetts,
yeah.
right? We tend to think about
Hmm.
the loyalists all leaving Massachusetts with the British, but
Hmm.
there still were these enclaves where the Declaration was not wanted and not received well.
Hmm. Speaking of stories, I mean, you also have this site, Declaration Stories, where you do share a lot of these stories. And in fact, people can subscribe, and they'll get an email from you with a new story that you have found. So, what have been some of your favorites, along with Kezia Coffin's?
Yeah. So, as everyone who's written a book knows, there's too much to fit
Yeah.
in the book. And my book was my dissertation. So, I even,
Mhm.
had a lot of stuff
Right.
from years of research in grad school that I just couldn't fit in. So, I wanted to, make sure those stories saw the light of day, and figured that a newsletter format would be a great way of just showing people all of the different pieces of history that are represented by this text that we think
Mhm.
of as the Declaration of Independence. So I've included a lot of different, printed copies so far. This newsletter will run through July 2026, so there's many more to come. I've been able to tie in to some of the stories that are in the book that are explored in more
Mhm.
detail, but also ones that I didn't have space for, including in Europe. There's all sorts of translations. The Declaration
Mhm.
either excerpted or printed in full in newspapers in Europe, and I could only cover a small portion of those. So that's a really exciting way to, introduce people to the Italian and the
Mhm.
Polish and the German translations of the Declaration that they may not know existed in 1776.
It's really amazing. And the Jefferson and the committee are writing something that will draw support. They're not writing something that's going to be a path-breaking new idea. So what are some of the features of the deck? Let's just talk about the text itself and what it says and how it's structured.
Yeah, I tend to describe the Declaration when I'm talking to the public or preparing folks for events in 2026 as building an argument. So, of course, the opening sentences lay out these universal truths that set the sort of philosophical foundation for the Declaration. And those sentences are what we are most familiar with years later, because they have been invoked by generations of not only Americans, but people around the world. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, all men are created equal. The part that's least familiar to folks is the longest part of the Declaration. That's the list of grievances against King George III. And some of that language feels archaic. Some of the examples don't feel super relevant. But in every political moment in our history as a nation, people have found parallels within that list of grievances. So that the language is still applicable. And then the final paragraph of the Declaration, to me, is the most important in 1776. It's the paragraph that when the Declaration is excerpted in European newspapers or in the Treaty of Watertown or other documents, the last paragraph is the key, because that marks the transition from dependent colonies to independent states. And it says all of the things that the United States now have the power to do. We tend to focus so much on the opening sentences that we forget about the rest of the document.
Right. It really is putting in the Virginia resolution that these 13 colonies are and ought to be free and independent states. And he said it lists what free and independent states can do.
Exactly. And the committee draft of the Declaration, that final paragraph did not use the language of the Virginia resolution. And so that's where the Congress kind of made some edits to make sure that that language is reinforced, that the resolution that they voted for is represented fully in the Declaration of Independence, that text that's going to go out into the world explaining their decision to approve that resolution.
And then, of course, there are other things that are taken out from the committee draft that Jefferson thought should be in. One is the passage about the British public, that we could have been a great and prosperous, free and great and prosperous people together. They're very disappointed that the British public hasn't been supporting this. Also, the passage on the slave trade, which is the last of the grievances they're listing about the Crown.
Absolutely. And that grievance about the transatlantic slave trade, I would say in the last 10 or 15 years has become a real tool for civic education. Almost to the deficit of the rest of the document, that when teachers have limited time to talk about the Declaration, they spend it talking about that cut grievance and the implications. I think it's really interesting that the knowledge of who wrote the Declaration, who the principal author was, that doesn't come out until the 1790s when, Jefferson's political, power is starting to rise. And the knowledge of what was in the committee draft of the Declaration doesn't come out until after George Wythe's murder, when his papers are made public by a Richmond newspaper printer. That's in 1806, right in the middle of Jefferson's presidency. So we forget that in 1776, no one knew about this grievance or any of the pieces that were changed by Congress. And there was years of speculation about whether Jefferson's words were better than the final version that were clarified after the fair copy that Jefferson sent to George Wythe was published in newspapers in 1806.
Jefferson certainly did think that his original version was better.
Absolutely.
Now, there are a couple of other places famous because they say we actually had the idea first, like Mecklenburg in North Carolina. Do you talk at all about any of these other earlier?
I don't. I think Pauline Mayer's book, American Scripture, does a phenomenal job of showing all of the local declarations. And then the Mecklenburg Declaration, it's a particularly interesting case where I think historians, the consensus is that the original, the surviving Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence is not the original, that someone tried to recreate it and they were, influenced by the words of the Declaration of Independence. So when Jefferson and Adams find out about the Mecklenburg Resolution, they're, gobsmacked by it, and they're trying to figure out, how could this have happened? How could we have not known about it? But I think it was a sort of created in reverse, kind of. And it's interesting to think about in the context of all the other local declarations. I tend to tell people that there was this vocabulary of independence that was circulating for a long time that predated Thomas Paine's common sense, but certainly was reinforced by it. And so when Congress decides to draft a Declaration of Independence, they are still using that same vocabulary that has been used by others. And it's not a case of plagiarism. And I hate to get into, who came first or who used this language first, because it's more just that there was this sense of the need for independence, and everyone was using the same kind of language to justify that decision.
Yeah. And of course, Jefferson initially thinks, according to what we know from his recollections and Adams' recollection, that he thought Adams was going to write this, but Adams pushes him to write it.
Yeah, I say in the book that the men at the center of the story had frustratingly foggy memories.
Yes.
And by their own accounts, which are influenced by their later, struggles and their political careers, their autobiographies are just not reliable. And so we have to, Pauline Maier called it a puzzle for which we may not ever get all the pieces to figure out how the Declaration was actually drafted. So while I do spend time on that, and of course people always ask me questions about the drafting, I tend to focus more on what came next and the printing of it.
Right. Why do you think it's so important to us to know who wrote it and know about that process of writing? Usually isn't that interesting, as you know, having been writing a book and other things.
I don't know. I don't know if it's because of Jefferson and Adams's later political careers, that if they had just kind of fallen into the background, if no one would pay much attention to who drafted the Declaration. At the time in 1776 and really through the end of the war, the Continental Congress was the author of the Declaration. And there's one really interesting broadside printing created in London that's now at the John Carter Brown Library. They have the only extant copy. And I wrote about this in Declaration Stories a few weeks ago. It's a broadside of the Declaration with a portrait of John Hancock at the top, because he is the name associated with the Declaration. And he was known in Europe both as being president of the Continental Congress, but also for his mercantile career. So whereas later decorative sort of engravings and lithographs use portraits of Jefferson and Adams and even Washington, in 1776, it was Hancock whose name was kind of associated. Not that they thought he wrote the document himself, but just he signed it, he authorized it.
Right. And on that Dunlap printing, his name and Charles Thompson's are the only ones there.
Exactly.
So we're talking with Emily Sneff, historian of the Declaration of Independence. Her book, When the Declaration Was News, is coming out in April of 2026. And she's also been working with the Museum of the American Revolution on an exhibit opening this week on the Declaration's journey. Let's talk a little bit about the Declaration's journey and this great exhibit that the museum is going to be hosting.
Sure. So I've been working as part of the curatorial team for this exhibit for the past few years, along with Phil Mead, Amy Ellison, and Matt Skick. And it really is a team effort, because the Declaration's journey is covering 250 years of the Declaration's global influence. And when you walk into the space, it's amazing how much we actually fit in there. Credit to the fabricators and the designers. It's a really incredible space. And what I love about museum work is that you're able to bring objects together that have never before been in the same space and either complete a story or create new through lines. And so the Declaration's journey is showing both the physical travels of the Declaration of Independence beginning in 1776, but also how the structure and the language of the Declaration have inspired all these different political and social movements, both around the world and then back in the United States. So for example, we have one of the manuscript copies of the Haitian Declaration of Independence. And as you're looking at that, if you turn, you'll see that across the room, there's a Panama hat that was more than likely worn by Frederick Douglass when he was ambassador to Haiti towards the end of his career. And so those two objects have never been in the same space at the same time, but it speaks to this delayed acknowledgement of Haitian independence by the United States, that Jefferson refused to acknowledge Haitian independence. It wasn't until during the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln that the U.S. recognized Haiti, and then Douglas later serves as ambassador after his long career of using the Declaration to fight for the same things that are being talked about in Haiti, this refusal to return to any form of slavery. So it's those kinds of stories happening in the same space that when you see everything, there's only so much you can do on paper ahead of time. You think things are going to work, and then you see them in the space and you realize this is an incredible way of showing the Declaration's legacy across different time periods and different streams of influence.
You mentioned the translations of it into Polish and Italian, and then this exhibit carries that forward, showing the importance of the ideas.
Absolutely. Yeah, we have one of the first objects that you'll see is one of the first translations created in Philadelphia within days of July 4th. That's the German broadside printing on loan from Gettysburg College. But then as you go through the space, there's all sorts of other declarations in other languages. And we use audio elements as well to reinforce that sort of multilingual aspect. One of my favorite objects, and an object it required a lot of diplomacy to get it here, is a printing press on loan from the National Library of Chile. And that press was actually sent from the US to Chile to be used to fight for independence. So it was the press on which the first newspaper of Chile, the Aurora de Chile, was printed, edited by Camilo Enriquez, who was the sort of Ben Franklin figure of Chilean independence. But there were supporters of South American independence movements in the US who sent this press, one of them being Robert R. Livingston's brother. So there's all these connections.
And Livingston, of course, was on the committee that drafted the Declaration.
Exactly. And this printing press, we have the newspapers and broadsides and handbills that were printed on it, displayed alongside the press, returning to the U.S. for the first time since it was sent there, and showing the importance of communication technologies. So that press, it speaks to the Spanish translations of documents like the Declaration and Common Sense and sort of the early print culture down in Santiago. And it's a very big object. We're very glad to have it in the space because it reinforces this idea of translating, but also communicating those translations to the public.
It's amazing. And of course, the Declaration was meant to place these facts before a candid world. So the world listened for a long time. Yeah. We're talking with Emily Sneff, historian of the Declaration of Independence, talking about the Declaration's Journey, which is an exhibit opening at the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, which has all kinds of really interesting features to this continuing story of the Declaration. If we can go back a minute, we talked about the Treaty of Watertown briefly, and in some sense that was inspired because the delegation from Maine of Micmac and Abenaki had come, and then the Declaration arrived. So it requires really a new relationship between these people and Massachusetts, these former colonial figures.
Absolutely. And the Treaty of Watertown is or Watertown for those of you not in the Philadelphia area, it's a really great sort of case of something that I had been writing about, and then it came off the page in our exhibit. So we have an early manuscript copy of the treaty on view. And we talk about the fact that the first formal acknowledgement of the United States as an independent, sovereign entity came from Native Americans, not from Europe. And so the Wolastoqiyik and Mi'kmaq representatives who were in Watertown were the first to acknowledge both the Declaration and the United States. And that last paragraph of the Declaration is incorporated into the first paragraph of the treaty purely because of the coincidence of the Declaration arriving in the middle of their meeting. When these chiefs came down from Maine and Nova Scotia, they thought they were going to be meeting with George Washington. They didn't know that he had moved on. They certainly, no one expected that the Declaration would arrive in the middle of their conversation, and it influences, the text of the treaty itself. But we make that very clear before visitors learn about the French alliance and the sort of,
Right.
acknowledgement of the U.S. by other European powers, that it was first these indigenous and First Nations men who acknowledged both the Declaration and the United States.
It's interesting. Next July 18th of 2026, they will be reenacting the Treaty of Watertown in Watertown, which is here in Massachusetts. So thank you. It's really fascinating, all of these connections that this document had, and it really underlines its importance, which sometimes when we're simply looking at the revolution, we underplay that this really is a signal moment in history.
It is. And, for me as a historian, I tend to focus on the founding era. My book is, about an 8-month period of time in 76 to 77. And working on the Declaration's journey really expanded my view of the Declaration and, took me out of my comfort zone. I learned about movements that even growing up in the Philadelphia area, I had no idea about. The Korean Congress that met in Philadelphia to support Korean independence from Japan. The annual Reminder Day outside of Independence Hall, a predecessor before Stonewall to the Pride parades. There's all these sort of returns to Independence Hall and to the language of the Declaration that, it makes me, every time I walk past Independence Hall now, I feel like that was a signal moment. Like, I understand why the Pennsylvania State House was renamed as Independence Hall, because it is iconic and it is a sort of inspirational moment in time for all sides of American history as well as global history. I mean, the exhibit, we include the Confederacy and their claim on the Declaration. We include Martin Luther King Jr. and Abraham Lincoln. So it's really working on the exhibit while working on my book. I've kind of expanded beyond 1776 to appreciate why this event is worth celebrating 250 years later.
Maybe more historians should do this when they're working on books, also to work on an exhibit that's related but not exactly it.
Yeah, it was a really interesting experience because when you're writing labels and then fixing your chapters, you're thinking about different modes of presenting the Declaration to the public. And I love that mix of short form and long form. And I'm a very sort of visual historian. I think about, what the Declaration looked like on the page, the messiness of the process of declaring independence, the typos, the ink splatters, all of that. And so having some of those objects that I've written about be in the exhibit that I'm thinking about and kind of bringing to life with the help of our team, it's been really great. And seeing the exhibit, I'm really excited for visitors to come in and kind of get to see it for themselves. My own experience walking through it for the first time was kind of awe at everything that we have in there.
I look forward to seeing it too. And we mentioned Frederick Douglass briefly, and of course, one thing that has become a ritual in some places, like here in Massachusetts, is a reading of his July 5th speech, is What to the American Slave is Your 4th of July. And he's critiquing it, also critiquing what has happened since, but he's basing the fundamental ideas of liberty and all men being created equal, something very important to the nation, and he sees a betrayal as opposed to, boy, this was really simple hypocrisy.
Yeah, and I think Douglass sets a really important example that we can also see in the women's rights movements with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Matilda Jocelyn Gage writing declarations. We can see it in the temperance movement, the labor movement. And actually, we can see it starting in 1776 with the first British critiques of the Declaration, where they're using the form of the Declaration, really thinking about the grievances probably more carefully than the Congress had time to, and kind of either applying them to other injustices or acknowledging the fact that there's hypocrisy in saying all men are created equal and pushing back against royal authority, but then allowing slavery to continue in the United States. The British critics in 1776 see that. Frederick Douglass sees that. Other abolitionists, Lemuel Haynes, as early as 1776, is commenting on that. So I think that there's an example of not hate towards the United States, but hope for living up to the principles of the Declaration, to actually ensuring that all men or all human beings are created equal and have those rights. So I love seeing that in, I'll find newspaper printings and all sorts of things through time of people using the language of the Declaration to analyze it and to push for more. And I think Douglass, the fact that his oration has become a great tool for civic education, and I know in Massachusetts and other places has become a sort of an extension of readings of the Declaration, creating a more thoughtful event. And I hope that continues, because his oration, that one oration, was not his only time invoking the Declaration. But like Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, it's the most famous time when he invoked the Declaration, and it really pushes us to question what the Declaration, who gets to inherit the Declaration, who does the language of the Declaration belong to.
And it's really a phenomenal thing to think about and be part of our national identity, is starting with this fundamental premise that then we're pushed to live up to. And it always raises me the question is why they make this the starting point, if unless they believed it. If it would be much easier to say we don't like the tax policies and we want to set our own tax policies, but instead it's this broad affirmation, a self-evident truth that all men are created equal and have certain inherent inalienable rights, and they create governments in order to secure rights. It's such a radical idea.
I always tell people that the Declaration of Independence didn't need to be what it was. That the structure was not preordained. The things that had to be included were not specified by the Continental Congress. So I do give Thomas Jefferson and the committee credit for coming up with what exactly was included and how the document was arranged, because it didn't need to express self-evident truths, but it did. And that kind of set up an expectation for what the United States would be like, that we have continued to struggle to meet, 250 years on. The Declaration could have just been the last paragraph. It could have been much shorter. It could have been much longer. So we forget that the Declaration kind of was the originator of a genre that other countries and other movements have followed. But the language was kind of just chosen by the men working on it as befitting the moment. And it created this sort of need through time to go back to those founding principles, and from the Constitution through the Bill of Rights to all of the sort of movements for civil rights through time, they keep going back to the Declaration of Independence in a way that I'm not sure the guys in 1776 really expected.
No, it's an amazing story. So, Emily, I know you've been busy with the exhibit and getting your book done. We could probably talk for the rest of the day about the Declaration. We'll look forward to reading the book and seeing the exhibit, as well as the Declaration Stories newsletter. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I'm so glad to have the chance to chat with you.
So we've been talking with Emily Sneff, historian of the Declaration of Independence, author of When the Declaration of Independence Was News, coming out next spring, as well as the newsletter Declaration Stories, and also one of the curators of this great exhibit, Declaration's Journey, at the Museum of the American Revolution. So thank you so much, Emily, for taking time to talk to us.
Thanks, Bob.
And thanks to Jonathan Lane, our producer, and our listeners around the world. Every week we thank folks in different places who are regularly tuning in. And if you're in one of these places and want some of our Revolution 250 swag, send Jonathan an email, jlane@revolution250.org. And this week, listeners in Dallas and Fort Worth, in Ridgefield, Connecticut, Detroit, Michigan, Mount Lebanon, Pennsylvania, Leesburg, Florida, Johannesburg, South Africa, Queen Creek, Arizona, and Queens, New York. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you to everyone in places between and beyond. And now we will be piped out on the road to Boston.